Howdy everyone. So, Rocky V. Common wisdom says it's the worst one. It was released to unanimous disdain way back in 1990 and has spent the better part of 35 years as something of a punching bag for the series. Many are quick to point out how silly the movie was for taking Rocky out of the ring, how its antagonists are the weakest ones in the series, and how it was such a sour ending to Rocky's story that it forced his creator to take another crack at things 16 years later. But is it really that bad? Like, is it truly an irredeemable mess that deserves the reputation it's gotten over the past 3.5 decades? I honestly don't think so. While there's no denying that it isn't amazing or anything, I've always enjoyed it for what it was and felt that it's better than most people seem to give it credit for. So today, I thought it'd be fun to talk through some of the things I love about Rocky V, namely how it riffs off of the rest of the series. I'm also going to talk about how I think it might even be a better Rocky movie than one of the franchise's most beloved entries. Not that it's necessarily a better film, mind you, but that it does a better job of fitting the criteria of being a Rocky movie. Why? Well, because I think the movie could use some love for starters, and because I felt like it'd be a great excuse to do a video on one of my favorite franchises. Okay, so just to make sure we're all on the same page for this video, I want to start nice and slow by giving a brief primer on the series and defining what I think makes a Rocky movie a Rocky movie.
The original Rocky came out in 1976. It was directed by John G. Avildsen and was written by and stars Sylvester Stallone as the titular Rocky. He's a down-on-his-luck boxer from Philadelphia who gets to live out the American dream following a 1,000,000-to-1 matchup against the heavyweight champion of the world, Apollo Creed. The movie was a massive success, with its production and release basically mirroring the film and how it blew Stallone's career up. In the same way that Rocky went from a leg breaker for the mob to a high-profile celebrity overnight, Stallone basically went from playing extras and also starring in a softcore porno, really, to the guy who wrote and starred in that year's Best Picture winner. In a very competitive year too, might I add.
And then it went on to win the Oscar over Taxi Driver, over Network.
I know, great year. President's Men, Seven Beauties.
What followed was a fairly reliable pattern for Sly "The Rock" Stallone's career. He would either write, direct, and/or star in the odd project. Usually either have it do only okay critically or get absolutely dumped on, then return to the Rocky franchise for a new entry, now also directing the films in conjunction with writing and starring in them.
Will you retire after this fight?
Oh yeah, this is the last one for sure. After this, me make a finish. This is definitely the last one.
And the movies themselves are also very formulaic, with each film using the same basic outline and then just mad-libbing several details into them until they have a unique identity. Rocky 1 is a classic underdog story. His life sucks and he feels like a loser until he gets the opportunity to prove otherwise. He trains for the big fight while juggling issues in his personal life, as well as his budding relationship with Adrian, and is only really fighting for the opportunity to prove that he can go the distance, which he succeeds in despite losing the fight. Rocky 2 builds off of this, showing us Rocky's new life as a person of notoriety. He's bad at managing his finances and learns that he's partially blind in one eye from the last movie's fight, but has to learn how to work past that because fighting's the only thing he knows how to do and Apollo wants a rematch. And through sheer perseverance, skill, and maybe because that priest shot him a prayer upstairs, who knows, he ultimately wins. Rocky 3 takes things a step further by showing us that the good life Rocky earned after the last fight has softened him up. The character loses himself to fear and trauma when his trainer and surrogate father figure Mickey dies of a heart attack before his last fight. Because of this, he loses the title and his confidence. But lo and behold, Apollo shows up to help him get it all back. Also, Adrian says damn it on a beach.
What's the truth, damn it?
I'm afraid!
And Rocky 4 builds off of this framework even more. Rocky and Apollo are just straight up friends now, but when a big scary Soviet comes to town, Apollo lets his patriotism get the better of him by challenging him to a fight that ultimately leads to his death. Rocky is absolutely charged up by this and wants to avenge his friend, forfeiting the title he won back in Rocky III to go to the Soviet Union and fight the Russian on Christmas Day. He comes out victorious and also somehow ends the Cold War in the process. His prize for ending 40 years of political tension? Well, brain damage, but we'll get to that soon. If you've been paying attention, you've probably noticed the pattern that these movies operate under. Rocky usually has some existential or physical issue he needs to surmount, and the only place he could do that from is in the ring. In Rocky 1, it's his self-esteem.
In Rocky 2, it's the gruesome twosome of his eye injury plus his desire to support Adrian and his kid.
Rocky 3 brings us back to self-esteem with a dash of guilt now, and Rocky 4 kinda biffs that part of the story in favor of mild propaganda, but we'll also get into that later. Basically, the guy's all heart, and that carries over into how these movies are constructed. Most of them are held together by an incredibly human, piano-driven score by Bill Conti. And when they break from that, we're often treated to heart-pounding renditions of songs like Gonna Fly Now, Going the Distance, and Conquest. Songs whose titles imply transcending our natural human limitations. And without counting the Creed series, since they're technically a spin-off, this never really changes throughout the original 6 movies. There's also something consistently New Hollywood about them too. New Hollywood, or New American Filmmaking as it's also called, was the movement that defined 70s cinema in the US. Many of its movies were rougher around the edges than what had come before it, making use of more natural or minimal lighting, usually feeling looser and more character-driven than a normal studio film, and also featuring a harder slant towards ambiguous endings than the typical Golden Age film would have too. Traits that the original Rocky, as well as its sequels to a consistently lessening extent, exhibit in spades. The movies feature stuff like training montages, which were an already well-known technique amongst filmmakers, yeah, but truly hit their zenith in the years after Rocky. The freeze-frame ending, which literally stops the film in its tracks at the character's high point, and even a simple title crawl that opens each film, asterisked, and basically establishes them as being a character study. They're very emblematic of what filmmaking was like in the years each entry came out. The first Rocky came out squarely in the middle of the New Hollywood era, and it has a really slow, methodical pace to it that's
Textbook New Hollywood.
Its first sequel still carries some of that DNA, especially because Heaven's Gate hadn't killed the movement yet, but feels lighter on its haunches thanks to more humor and a general softening of its characters. Rocky 3 continues to lighten things up by injecting rock music into the soundtrack with Survivor's Eye of the Tiger, which feels in line with the MTV era it came out in and the pending explosion of Don Simpson, Jerry Bruckheimer films like Flashdance, Top Gun, and Beverly Hills Cop. And Rocky 4 is, well, it's honestly just the natural conclusion to Rocky 3's evolution, loading the film with multiple pop songs and compositions that feel tailor-made to be singles or shown as videos on MTV.
So, with that all being said, how does Rocky 5 fare when it comes to these elements? Honestly, pretty well.
It's obvious from the opening scenes of Rocky 5 that it was initially intended to be a major course correction for the series. By the end of Rocky 4, the character basically had nowhere to go but full circle. He had already become the heavyweight champion of the world twice, fought a character that was explicitly written as the peak of human physicality, and had already lost the 2 characters that were most related to his time in the ring. So, perhaps to really iron in the fact that this was going to be it for the character, Stallone decided to team up with the original Rocky's director, John G. Avildsen, and send the Italian stallion back to Philly for one last flick.
Yo, Adrian! Did we ever leave this place?
I don't know.
And the way they accomplished this is admittedly kinda dumb. They basically just introduce a major rug pull in the form of Rocky losing his money due to tax shenanigans. Because of this, Rocky is totally broke, but he's also unable to step into the ring to solve this problem due to brain damage that's begun to manifest itself after his fight with Drago. This forces his family to relocate back to Paulie's old place in Philly, and for Rocky to reopen Mickey's gym in order to make a living. Like I said, it's a very obvious course correction for the series. For instance, Rocky IV barely featured Philly. It's also the only Rocky movie that doesn't feature a visit to the Philly Museum art steps, which is basically made up for through some stock footage in the movie itself, as well as 2 visits to it in the sequel. The film is also a decided return to the humbler, somewhat unrefined depiction of Rocky from the first 2 movies. He wears his old jacket, picks up on smoking again, and goes to bars. If the other sequels turned Rocky more into a poster child for who we should strive to be, like an honest goody-goody two-shoes who fights in the name of honor or whatever, Rocky V reminds us of the person who originally aspired to be those things. Sure, Rocky has always been an honest, good guy, but those sequels gradually turned that into the entire character. Even though the movie itself can be very overblown and melodramatic, it at least feels a bit more grounded in reality than the previous one did. Because let's be real, Rocky IV is basically a comic book. It represented the furthest pivot the series made from reality, taking a story that went out of its way to depict the squalor of 70s Philadelphia and the divide between the working class and the wealthy, and bent it into a propaganda piece about how Russians are either in the pocket of the state, someone dispatched to spy on Rocky, or just straight up abusing steroids. And like, ew? I'm not saying that every Rocky needs to be a piece of social commentary, but a bit of consistency and depth would have been nice. Even Rocky III manages to have that a bit. I mean, sure, that movie also just thought it would be funny to have Paulie be casually racist and complain about the area Rocky was training in, but it at least tried to say something in the process.
We gotta leave. I got a reputation.
What do you mean, reputation?
You heard. I don't like these people.
You don't like them? Well, maybe they don't like you either, boss.
What I do to them?
The most Rocky IV does is say that all the commies started rooting for him during the fight and that they should try capitalism out or something. But Rocky V is surprisingly cool because it doesn't do that. It even goes out of its way to comment on the state of Philadelphia and, by proxy, many cities in the US.
Ain't this where the atomic cookie shop used to be?
I'm new here, Dad.
Oh, this neighborhood's coming down with tooth decay.
It's called Urban Blight.
Yeah?
I'll tell you something, this place is blighting everywhere, you know.
And with it, we already have something I absolutely love about this movie. It brings back some of that, by then old, New Hollywood charm back to the series. It features a bit more wide shots and longer takes than the last Rocky movie did. There's more low-key and motivated lighting. The story and pace are slower and feel more like Rocky or Rocky II again. We have some idea of where things will inevitably end for our protagonist, but the movie takes its sweet time getting there. Not to mention, Rocky V gave us Bill Conti again. Bill Conti's iconic score is undeniably a huge part of what makes Rocky special, and in Rocky V, the guy behind stuff like Gonna Fly Now and The Final Bell returned to the franchise for the first time since 1982. Apparently, Billy Boy was set to return for Rocky IV, but got fired from the project before that could become a reality. I only have a post on TV Tropes to go off for this, and I couldn't find a specific source for the comment itself, but it seems like this was due to a dispute between him and Stallone. Either way, he was absent for Rocky vs. the Russian,
Sounds like a damn monster movie.
and instead ended up working with Avildsen on The Karate Kid. Thankfully though, they seem to have worked things out for Rocky V because he's back and he genuinely put down some great work on the soundtrack. It's classic Rocky through and through, with the movie even recycling Conquest from Rocky II for its opening credits. A choice that, when coupled with what I consider to be some great editing choices, leads to one of my favorite openings to a Rocky movie. The way the music works against the slowed down tinted footage just has this great sense of weight to it. And speaking of weight, that's a great way to describe what works about Rocky V's story. By taking away everything that Rocky has earned over the past 14 years, it gives us something that the last movie sorely lacked: relatable, relatively grounded stakes. They're established from as early as right after the credits. Rocky's body is finally given up on him after all these years in the ring. He later finds out that he has brain damage, and that, because of it, he has to retire from boxing. So what else can he do other than reopen Mighty Mick's gym and try to become the father figure he saw in Burgess Meredith's Mick back in the first 3 movies? Sure, Mick was a classically grouchy dick to him, but he was also the only guy who saw potential in Rocky and was mean to him because he thought he was squandering his potential.
Because you had the talent to become a good fighter, and instead of that, you became a leg breaker, some cheap second-rate loan shark.
It's a living?
It's a waste of life.
And now that he can't tap into that potential anymore, he wants to help people tap into theirs.
Remember, I'm like this angel sitting on your shoulder, okay? I ain't gonna let nothing happen to you, okay? Go, guy.
It's a great play on one of the elements of a Rocky movie that I highlighted earlier, specifically that he's suffering from something existential or physical. And here, it's made even worse because it's both of those things and he can't get it out of his system by fighting in the ring. Furthermore, his choice to run the gym just makes sense for his character. We've already seen him beg Mick for a job there in Rocky 2, so this is some pretty great characterization since it ties into something we already know about him, that he needs to be close to boxing to feel alive.
If I can't fight no more, maybe I can help out around here, you know?
You know, you're like royalty here, kid. You want those guys to see you carrying towels and buckets around. Where's your dignity?
I don't know how to say this, you know, just... I gotta be around it.
Stuff like that also frees Rocky V up to spend its time telling new, different stories. And while two of these stories are admittedly the weakest ones in the franchise, here's to you, Rocky Jr. Bully Arc, and most of Tommy Gunn's character, they're not without some merit due to how they tie into the larger themes of the film.
Rocky V loves to talk about Rocky's legacy. It's the subtext behind the first scene of dialogue in the movie. While Rocky's posing like Sisyphus pushing a frickin' boulder up a hill, Duke is yelling about how well he did in his fight against Drago. He tells him that he pulled through like the champ that he is and how he did everyone proud, especially Apollo. It's a short exchange that's kind of revealing when you think about it. Duke is talking about the Herculean figure that Rocky ended the last movie as. The image of the character that had been built up over the years as an unstoppable force of nature in the ring. But just as soon as that's established to us, we're arguably shown Rocky at the lowest point of his career. It's ending. The film then spends time establishing his relationship with his son, Rocky Jr., who's played by Stallone's actual son, Sage Stallone. They're clearly close and obviously love each other, with Rocky literally showering his son with praise on the way to his first day of school and talking to him more as an equal than as a parent. Things obviously hit hard times between them as the movie wears on, in no small part due to Tommy Gunn showing up and hijacking the part of Rocky's brain that produces dopamine at the thought of punching things, but there's a fairly nice foundation to the film for some character work here. And the same kinda goes for Tommy too, since there's something interesting about featuring a character that's explicitly written as Rocky 2.0. At a time when Rocky's trying to be a better role model for his son, who, need I remind you, is literally named Rocky Jr., he meets someone that came from a similar background to him.
I realize I don't come from the same streets as you do, but I'm hungry, like you were.
We even get an added bonus from the fact that Tommy comes from a broken home and has a bad relationship with his father, making him the ideal candidate for being the Rocky to Rocky's Mickey.
My old man, he used to drink a lot, seriously. He'd go out with his friends and tie one on, then he'd come home and look to punch on me, you know. He'd punch on my mother, too. If I tell you the first guy I ever knocked out was my father.
It's a great setup for a capper to the series. Rocky is now in Mickey's role, and he has to contend with raising his son to be better than he ever was, while also going head-to-head with someone who embodies the person he used to be. Does he just want to be a good dad and let his legacy be the life Rocky Jr. makes for himself? Or does he want to hold on to the glory days for just a bit longer through some fan-turned simulacrum?
Look, all I'm saying is that that's one hell of a premise for a movie. And if you don't believe me, just take a look at Rocky Balboa and The First Creed. Two movies that basically lift elements from Rocky V, such as exploring Rocky's relationship with his son and Rocky taking on a pupil who wants to make a name for himself and not coast off of a legacy.
Plus, it's not like Rocky isn't struggling with how he perceives his own legacy too. For starters, he had to be talked into retiring by his wife. He also straight up expresses grief at having to move back to Philly due to how he thinks it's below what his family deserves. It's a somewhat shallow way of looking at what's going on, but it's also fairly real and understandable. We've seen this character handle wealth in the past, and we've also seen him struggle with his finances. Like, of course he ends up totally enamored with Tommy and trying to mold him in his image. And of course he inevitably ends up ignoring his family in the process. We saw him do something like that back in Rocky 2.
When that kid was in the ring, you know what I was doing? I was winning. When he was winning, I was winning.
You were winning?
Yeah, it was. It was my last chance at getting some respect for us.
The intended emotional arc for Rocky V almost reads as the explicit course correction that the movie itself embodies. By taking Rocky out of the ring, it seeks to remind the viewer that Rocky was never really about boxing. It was a love story between two people that society deemed losers. It was also a story about a person trying to come to respect himself and dream a little. While boxing is definitely a huge part of the franchise, it's at its best when it's only a visual manifestation of everything the character is going through. He's struggling, and through meeting Adrian and getting the chance to change his life by going up against Apollo, finally decides to start fighting back. In Rocky V, the composite to this idea is Rocky using the opportunity to run Mighty Mix and train Tommy as his chance to support his family and maybe even regain his fortune. The movie tears him down so that we could see him want to claw his way back up to the top again, only now as a seasoned mentor and not just in terms of financial status. The final fight with Tommy is even a straight up street fight, which perfectly complements this. He's not in it for the money anymore. He's fighting because he has problems and he needs to get it out of his system. By the end of the movie, nothing has really changed for him. In fact, he's basically right back where he started when he first moved back to Philly. He's still comparatively broke. Tommy's out of the picture, and he'll probably just fade into obscurity or become something of a local celebrity. But in the same way that Rocky 1 played him losing to Apollo off as a win due to the emotional victory of going the distance, Rocky 5 plays this off as a positive, to the point of the music leading up to and during the transition into the final scene being a new rendition of Gonna Fly Now. Yeah, he is still poor, but he's also right where he wants to be. Rocky has mended his relationship with his son and is bonding with him on his terms now. And more than that, we see him at the Rocky Steps of all places, which is then acknowledged as being part of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's a genuinely great scene and a great way to send off the characters since it's ending things at his most iconic locale. Something they got totally riffed on in Creed, by the way. The part of Rocky V's finale that really does it for me is how it ends with the two of them walking past the Rocky statue. We get the compulsory freeze frame ending, but unlike in every other film outside of Rocky Balboa where we freeze on Rocky at the emotional height of the story, we freeze on an image of the Rocky statue itself. We're then treated to blue-tinted stills from across the series over Elton John's The Measure of a Man. It's an emotional scene to watch, and I can only imagine how hard it must have hit fans in theaters who had been following the series since 1976. By juxtaposing that image of the character as he's been immortalized in pop culture against the memories that created it, Avildsen and Stallone do a great job of waving farewell to him. There's also a nice bit of harmony between the opening and closing of the movie too, because of the blue tinting. It almost turns it all into like folklore or something. But whereas the opening of the movie focused on the combat itself, the end of the movie reminds you that it was never about the fighting, but the reasons why he was fighting. Don't get me wrong, because I love Rocky Balboa, and I also love the Creed series, but this is pitch perfect filmmaking. Overly sentimental and schmaltzy, yeah, but the exact kind of send-off that Rocky deserves. There's a sense of immortality that gets played at here. It suggests that it doesn't matter that Rocky isn't the heavyweight champion of the world or that he doesn't have money anymore. He has the memories to look back on as the fruit of his labor. He's lived a good, full life, and anything past this moment is for him and him alone to enjoy with his family. The dude's been put through the fucking ringer for 14 years. He deserves a break after all of this.
Okay, I've probably talked about Rocky 5 enough for a minute, so let's just give it a break. At the beginning of the video, I also said that I'd be comparing it to another Rocky film that I felt was an inferior sequel in hindsight. So let's put that movie under the same microscope I just placed Rocky 5 under. And in case anyone hasn't figured out which movie I'm talking about from the title of this chapter or the few references I've made to it so far, I'm talking about Rocky 4.
I want to make one thing clear. I like Rocky 4. It was my second favorite Rocky growing up. My top 3 for the series basically went Rocky 2, Rocky 4, and then the original movie. Hearts on Fire was one of the first songs I ever bought on iTunes. My late best friend Mike and I used to watch the movie together at least once a year, and I probably have Vince DiCola's soundtrack committed to memory. But it also isn't a very good Rocky movie. If we look at the list of traits I outlined at the beginning of this video,
it doesn't stick the landing on any of them.
Bill Conti music? Gone.
In its place, we have that awesome electronic soundtrack by Coca-Cola.
There were a few references to Conti's work in the movie, yeah, but it's all heavily synthesized now. It lacks the heart that made them potent pieces of music and basically operates as incidental cues. How about that new Hollywood emphasis on character work and more naturalistic filmmaking? Well, that probably got lost in customs because a third of this movie takes place in music video style montage.
Additionally, Rocky doesn't have that deep of a reason to be fighting Drago in the first place. Sure, it's explicitly stated that he wants to avenge Apollo and all, but it doesn't come close to feeling as earned as any of his other motivations did, and also comes across as both being out of character and a bit reckless of him.
Whereas Rocky 1 Rocky didn't really care about what happened to him due to having something to prove, and Rocky 2 Rocky fought because he needed the money and to affirm that he really has the goods, Rocky 4's motivation of avenging his dead friend never really tracks. He's basically open to dying and throwing his entire fortune and life away because of what happens to Apollo, and we never really get any satisfying explanation for why outside of,
"'Cause I'm a fighter."
It makes sense within the obvious black and white framing of the story itself, but is shallow in execution due to the fact that Rocky was hardly ever a simple black and white story. In fact, dwelling on Rocky 4 makes it clear how three-dimensional each of his prior adversaries really were.
Apollo Creed was never a villain per se, but rather the embodiment of everything Rocky wasn't. He antagonizes Rocky, but we understand why, and those antagonizing tactics stand in opposition to the person we see him as being outside of the ring.
Stay in school and use your brain. Be a doctor, be a lawyer, carry a leather briefcase. Forget about sports as a profession. Sports make you grunt and smell. See, be a thinker, not a stinker.
In reality, Apollo was well-dressed, charismatic, and about as insecure as Rocky was. He was a human being. Clubber Lang was interesting because he's definitely a jackass who crosses the line, but we never got the sense that he was an outright villain. He was basically just an obstacle that represented what Rocky lacked, the eye of the tiger. But Drago is just Drago, at least until Creed 2. He gets little to no characterization outside of the declaration that he fights for himself at the end of the movie. The guy is literally just an obstacle. The only thing he represents is communism, and the lack of personality he's given, coupled with the only real thing we know about him being his doping and the fact that he killed Apollo, basically dehumanizes him. Because of this, Rocky 4 doesn't really feel like a Rocky movie anymore. It definitely has enough of the components from the series to qualify as an entry in the series, but it's lacking that secret sauce that makes it fully connect to the other entries. As much as I love it, it's the franchise at its most shallow, even if it's insanely fun to watch and has my favorite Paulie moment in the entire series.
You know, it's hard for me to say these kind of things because that ain't my way. But if I could just unzip myself and step out and be someone else, I want to be you. You're real hot, Rock.
Thanks, Paul.
Now blast this guy's teeth out.
I'll try.
One of the few things that Rocky IV got right for the series was capturing a snapshot of what the era was like. by its November 1985 release date, we had already gotten movies like Red Dawn and the remake for Invasion USA. Hell, Stallone himself had just put out Rambo First Blood Part 2 a few months earlier. The US was well into its era of highly patriotic, anti-communist Reagan movies, and Rocky IV may as well be the poster child for those types of films. But in leaning into that angle for the movie so hard, it ended up stripping the other recognizable elements of the series for parts. I mean, the movie doesn't even have the franchise's iconic opening crawl in it, for crying out loud. And yeah, a lot of the other elements are there, or at least somewhat winked at, but the stuff ends up coming off as feeling arbitrary in its execution. There is melodrama because Rocky and Adrian are gonna fight, of course, but because we never dwelled on it, nor was it given any dramatic weight, nobody cares. There are obviously montages in the movie, and they're admittedly some of the series' best, but they're also just glorified workout videos that you could watch on MTV while you're at the gym.
And I can't help but wonder if Stallone feels the same way about this movie since he went back to recut it.
Just in case you hadn't heard about it, Stallone spent a chunk of 2020 reworking Rocky IV into a new director's cut that he somewhat self-indulgently called Rocky IV, Rocky vs. Drago, the Ultimate Director's Cut.
Yo, you think you got enough names?
Patience, Dagger. Almost done.
It's a reworking of the movie that's only 2 minutes longer than the original, but replaces a number of its scenes with alternate ones, removes stuff like Polly's robot, and generally tries to better fit the tone of the movie in with other Rocky films and the Creed series. Oh yeah, and it recycled some Bill Conti music cues and added a title crawl back in. While interesting in its own right, especially because of its making of documentary you can watch on YouTube, I can't help but feel like it only makes Rocky IV's poor footing within the series stick out like a sore thumb. I know there's a new director's cut of Rocky Balboa that he recently completed too, as well as the Rocky V work print that I can only hope gets a proper release someday, but sitting down to watch this thing makes it pretty clear that the Rocky touch was largely missing from the original release. Because at the very least, those two other movies at least felt like Rocky movies from the outset. It's not even like I think this director's cut is better than the theatrical one or anything either. It's just that the inclusion of Bill Conti music, some of the alternate scenes, and the generally shifted pace do a lot to better fit the story in with the series. Pound for pound, it might actually be my least favorite film of the bunch, but it somehow also feels like a better Rocky movie than the theatrical cut did. Even if it was pretty horrendously cropped to 239:1 at points. Like, I seriously don't know what happened there. The making of documentary shows the original aspect ratio, and it looks just fine. You didn't need to add bars.
Look, I'm not going to pretend that Rocky V is a masterpiece because it obviously isn't, but I do think it's worth revisiting with a fresh set of eyes. It may have a ton of problems, such as Robert's whole bullying subplot and the overly 90s branded shallowness of the picture itself, but it makes a lot of interesting moves towards fitting in with the earlier Rocky movies that I find pretty commendable.
I know I didn't spend much, if any, time poking holes in this movie today, but that's only because a lot of its issues have already been well documented elsewhere. Like, we all know that the unexplained time jump is weird, or that it makes little to no sense for Rocky to not be able to build a fortune by using his celebrity status to do a few endorsements. While I've always found that kind of stuff really entertaining to just kind of jab at and have fun with, I don't really think they're actually worth criticizing. Plus, I actually kinda love some of the jankier, poorly aged aspects of this movie. For example, and citing my list from earlier in the video one last time, the movie feels pretty emblematic of where the world was at in 1990. The fight promoter Duke is very clearly supposed to be Don King. The push towards rap and R&B in the soundtrack heavily coincides with the explosion of that type of music within pop culture. And even stuff like taking the story back to humble roots feels like an extension of the looming end of the Cold War, since all American heroes and anti-Russian propaganda weren't as important as they used to be. And honestly, a lot of that stuff is pretty fun. Duke being envisioned as the original final boss for the series is pretty hilarious, and feels like a gentle lashing of promoters and money men in general. I also love that hip-hop influenced soundtrack. Stuff like Keep It Up and Go For It are genuinely catchy songs. Plus, old Billy Bob Conti even manages to squeeze some extra juice out of Keep It Up by contrasting it against more traditional music for the series during Rocky's fight with Tommy. If you listen close enough, or disable a few channels on the movie itself for a cleaner rip of the music, you might notice how stitched together and choppy it is at points. And while I personally think that this is at least partially the result of it being hastily put together following last-minute changes to the film, it totally works for the scene. As I've already said, Rocky V is about Rocky going up against the perceived legendary image of himself. This is personified in Tommy Gunn, who is repeatedly called a heartless mirage of the real thing. So having a gaudy rap song that was used for one of Tommy Gunn's montages juxtaposed against something that harkens back to the series' roots is pretty awesome. There's a push and pull to the two songs as they're mixed together. It's like they're fighting for dominance in the same way that Rocky and Tommy Gunn are. It embodies Rocky butting heads with his fear of losing everything, and it feels compatible with the scene where he talked to Tommy about fear.
Because fear is like this fire, all right? And it's burning deep inside. Now, if you control it, Tommy, it's gonna make you hot. But you see, if this thing here, it controls you, it's gonna burn you and everything else around you up. That's right, you know.
It's also a great compliment to his visions of Mickey, or the flashback scene with him too. There's a certain gone but not forgottenness to everything behind the scenes that screams Rocky V. And I think that honestly describes my thoughts on Rocky V pretty well. The movie is definitely something of a confused mess, and even some of the stuff that was left behind in its work print can only polish it so much. But I still don't know if I'd go as far as to call it a bad movie. A flawed one, absolutely, but one that feels like it's earned its place in the franchise. It may not be as overtly badass or fun as Rocky IV is, or have the more satisfying return to roots that Balboa does, but the movie works a lot better than people seem to give it credit for. It was the last time we ever saw Rocky, Paulie, and Adrian bouncing off of each other. It was the last time we saw Mickey, or the classic Mighty Mix. We may not have had Apollo or as much of his trainer Duke in this one, but it was the closest thing to a proper reunion of the original cast that we could have gotten.
Anyway, that brings us to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and that if you did, you decide to leave a like on it, subscribe if you aren't already, share it with a friend, and maybe just tell me a bit about your favorite Rocky movie in the franchise and why. I think my order for how much I love the movies basically goes like Rocky 1, Rocky 2, Rocky Balboa, followed by 3, followed by 5, followed by 4. I'm not counting the Creed movies because it's not part of the series in my opinion. That's Adonis Creed's story, but if I had to, I'd probably slide Creed in between Rocky 2 and Rocky Balboa. Creed 2, I don't know, like maybe after or before Rocky 4, and I haven't seen Creed 3 yet, which is like criminal. I'm actually planning to watch it tonight. So I'll just leave a huge question mark there. If anyone actually cares where it fits in my ranking, just ask in the comments. Additionally, if you like podcasts and you're looking for a fun one to put on, I highly recommend my two shows, Media Obscura and Glaring Admissions. They both live on the same RSS feed and are very similar shows. Media Obscura focuses on old and obscure movies and television, while Glaring Admissions focuses on classic, seminal pieces of cinema that myself or my co-host Raekwon have somehow never seen before. Like I said, they're on the same RSS feed, and if you don't even want to leave YouTube, we're actually doing uploads of every new episode right here to this channel. Even better, they're full video renditions with cutaway gags and all sorts of fun production stuff that is absolute torture to edit. You could also stalk me on Letterboxd if you want. It's available, there's a link in the description. Just go follow me on Letterboxd if you want to see what I watch every day. I'm doing a challenge where I watch a movie a day. It's been a lot of fun so far, and yeah, I don't know, go check out my Letterboxd. I might follow you back, who knows. Last but not least, feel free to check out my book. It's called Guppy Falls, and it's available on Amazon and Kindle Unlimited. It's a romantic comedy, coming-of-age, friends-to-lovers story set in the summer of 2013. I have a sequel I hope to put out by the end of the year, and I'm going to start working on another sequel to that one too. So you know, if you're into stuff like Perks of Being a Wallflower, Dazed and Confused, American Graffiti, John Hughes movies, or Reality Bites, I don't know, man, it might be for you. So yeah, bye.
Yo, Tommy, what are you doing here? You ought to be out there celebrating, right?
I'm challenging you to a fight. Anytime, any place, anywhere.
Hi.
That's right.
You're coming down here with these people asking me if I want to throw hands with you? Is that what this is about?
Yeah, that's what it's about. And I ain't nobody's robot, nobody's boy. Now you accept the challenge or you yellow.